There is one thing that history always teaches us too late. It's not that the truth ultimately triumphs. That's because, when she first appears, it is almost always rejected. Not because it's false, but because it arrives too early. Because it disrupts the established order. Because it threatens a power structure that is based precisely on ignorance or myth. The truth, contrary to what we like to believe, is not welcomed with open arms. It is not celebrated. She is not listened to calmly around a table. It is initially ignored, then ridiculed, and when it persists, it is fought. You have already seen this mechanism in action, perhaps in your career, perhaps in your personal life, perhaps on a historical scale. Take a simple example, almost school-like. At the beginning of the 17th century, a man points a telescope towards the sky. He observes Jupiter's moons. He observes something impossible according to the dogma of the time. Not everything revolves around the Earth. This man's name was Galileo. He was not calling for a political revolution. He was not preaching a new morality. He simply said, look, the facts are there. The reaction? Silence first, then awkwardness, then a trial. His observations are not to be disputed. He is asked to be quiet. He is forced to retract his statement. He ended his days under house arrest. For what? Because what he had seen threatened a worldview, and therefore an authority. 2 centuries later, the same scenario. An English naturalist observes nature for decades. The compare, the class, the doubt. And he arrives at a dizzying conclusion. Species are not fixed. They are evolving. Natural selection. Charles Darwin published his book in 1859. Once again, he is not directly attacking religion. He did not say, God does not exist. He said, that's how life seems to work. The reaction is immediate. A moral scandal, indignation, accusations of corruption of the human soul. For what? Because if man is no longer a special separate creation, then an entire symbolic hierarchy collapses. Same mechanism, a different century. And now, let's go back even further. Amsterdam, mid-17th century. A young man of 23 is reading the Bible, but he doesn't read it the way he was taught. He does not read it as if it were a text that descended from heaven. He reads it like a historian, like a lawyer, like an analyst of power relations. He asks simple questions, almost naive. Who wrote these texts? When? In what context? And above all, for what purpose? This young man's name was Baruch Spinoza. His community's reaction was immediate. He is excommunicated, publicly cursed, erased from social existence. For what? Because his questions did not only threaten a theological interpretation, they threatened an entire identity. Galileo, Darwin, Spinoza, 3 men, 3 eras, 3 different areas, and yet the same pattern. It is never the truth itself that poses a problem. The problem is what she's doing in power. When a truth challenges an authority, that it weakens a hierarchy, that it exposes the human origin of what presented itself as divine, then it becomes dangerous. And this is precisely where our story begins. Because if you look closely at the great truths called sacred, you will notice something strange. The most protected are often the ones that it is most forbidden to question. What if the most explosive idea in human history was not scientific, but religious? And if it didn't concern the stars, nor the biological origin of man, but a belief at the very heart of the identity of millions of people? Such an ancient belief, so deeply rooted that it has survived for over 3,000 years without ever really being questioned. The idea that the people of Israel were chosen by God, elected, set apart, distinct from all other peoples. You are familiar with this idea. Even if you are not a believer, even if you are not Jewish, it permeates the Bible. It structures the history of Judaism. It influences Christianity. It still influences global geopolitics today. But here's the question, the only one that really matters. Is this election a timeless divine truth, or the product of a specific historical context, of a political necessity, of a survival strategy? Why did this idea come about? At what exact moment? And most importantly, who did it serve? Because, as you know from experience, the most powerful stories are never born by chance. They meet a need. They are repairing a wound. They give meaning to a catastrophe. They transform defeat into destiny. What if Israel's election was of this nature? If you're still here, it's because you're not looking for simple answers. It's because you no longer need comfortable certainties. It's because you belong to those who are willing to face things head on, even when they are disturbing. Subscribe, not by reflex, not out of habit, but because this type of investigation only exists as long as a demanding public agrees to support it. Because what we are going to explore together is not a provocation. This is not an attack. It's an investigation. A rigorous, well-documented, respectful investigation, but without compromise. And to understand how a belief becomes sacred, how it establishes itself, how it has survived through the centuries. First, we need to understand how it came about. For centuries, there was no debate, no public controversy, no legitimate question, no critical distancing. There was a story, a clear narrative, a story repeated, passed down, internalized. Israel is the chosen people, chosen by God Himself, separated from other peoples, set apart, not by merit, but by divine decision. That is how the text presents it, without apparent ambiguity. In Deuteronomy, it is written that the Lord chose Israel among all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Not because there would be more of them, not because He would be stronger, but because God willed it so. And this choice is not presented as temporary. It is described as an eternal covenant, unconditional, irrevocable. God protects His people. The people obey divine law. And whatever happens, the link remains. This is the official version, the version taught, the version that has structured the collective imagination for over 3 millennia. But to understand the power of this story, we need to understand what it represented concretely for those who wore it. Because this belief did not remain abstract. It was experienced. It has been embodied. She was tested in the flesh when kingdoms disappeared, when the temples were destroyed, when exiles followed one after another, when the persecution struck. In those moments, the idea of election was not a pretension. It was a consolation. We are suffering, but we are chosen. We are defeated, but God has not abandoned us. We are scattered, but we remain a people. This belief gave meaning to the senseless. She transformed the catastrophe into an ordeal, the defeat in correction, suffering as a sign, and above all, it prevented dissolution. Because in exile, the greatest danger is not physical death, it is oblivion, l'assimilation, the silent disappearance. The election functioned like an invisible thread, a link that crossed borders, languages, and centuries. A constant reminder, you belong to something older than yourself. This is how a collective identity is maintained without territory, without an army, without a state, through memory, through storytelling, through repetition. And this rehearsal begins very early. It is based on the biblical text. Read, reread, commented on, interpreted as a living word. It is achieved through religious education, at the synagogue, at home, in the study. But it also involves something more diffuse, more subtle, a cultural catechism, parties, prayers, expressions, stories told to children. Even without explicitly mentioning the idea of elections, she's there, in the background. It was obvious. We are different. We have a mission. Our story is not like any other. And for a long time, no one sees any reason to question this. Why would we do that? This story allowed me to survive. He protected an identity. He brought coherence to centuries of dispersion. But here's the thing. When we stop for a moment, when we take a step back, when we reread these texts with less devout eyes, some cracks appear. They are discreet, almost invisible at first glance. Ambiguities in language, changes in tone from one text to another, minor contradictions, seemingly. Sometimes God seems universal, sometimes deeply tribal. Sometimes the alliance seems eternal, sometimes conditional, fragile, reversible. Time itself becomes blurred. When exactly does this election begin? With Abraham? With Moses? With the entry into Canaan? And above all, why does this idea become so important at certain times, and much less so for others? There are also the silences, entire centuries with little documentation, major events barely mentioned, historical ruptures that the text covers with a theological veil, as if something needed explaining, but without being named. These cracks, for a long time, were filled by faith, by tradition, through respect for the sacred. But from the moment we agree to ask another question, a simple but daunting question, everything changes. What if these texts were not merely revelations, but also buildings? And what if behind the divine language were there very human concerns involved? Fears, strategies, responses to very real historical crises. This is not an accusation. This is not a provocation. This is a working hypothesis, that of historians, philologists, archaeologists, those who do not ask, should I believe? More, how did this come about? When? And why at this precise moment? Because one thing is certain, no story is powerful, also structuring, also durable. It is not born without reason. And this is where the real investigation begins. Because the question is no longer whether if this belief is sacred to those who hold it. The question then becomes something else. What's going on when we read these texts like historians and not like believers? From that moment on, it all depends on how you read it. Not from what we read, but how do we read it? For centuries, the Bible has been received, never examined. People were commenting on it, but she wasn't questioned. It was sacred by definition. And that which is sacred has no history. He is timeless, out of context, beyond criticism. Then slowly, very slowly, another way of reading has emerged. Not in synagogues, not in churches, but in universities. Men, and later women, started to do something radical, something that seems commonplace to us today, but which was almost blasphemous at the time. They read the Bible as one reads any other ancient text, with tools, with methods, with a critical distance. They asked simple questions, but destabilizing. In what exact language was this text written? Which words are used, and which are not? At what point in time did these formulations appear elsewhere? What do we know about the political, social, and military context of these passages. This is what is called the historical critical method. She doesn't try to find out whether a text is spiritually true or false. She is trying to understand how it was produced. And to achieve this, it draws on several disciplines. Linguistics first, because languages evolve. The vocabulary is changing. The turns of phrase betray a particular era. A text written in the 10th century BC does not resemble a 6th century text, even though they speak of the same God, even if they tell the same story. Next, the historical context. Wars, the exiles, regime changes, contacts with other civilizations. None of this is neutral. A besieged people does not write like a dominant people. A people in exile does not think like a sovereign people. Then comes the comparison of the sources. We no longer read the Bible alone. It is read alongside other ancient texts. Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Canaanites. The accounts are compared, the laws, the founding myths, and then similarities appear. Very similar creation stories, laws that follow the same structure, common themes, the flood, the covenant, divine punishment. Finally, there's archaeology, not the one from the movies, not the one that miraculously confirms every verse, but this one, slower, more frustrating, which reveals layers of reality, destroyed cities, occupancy levels, registrations. There were absences too, because sometimes what we can't find is as telling as what we find. This is how modern exegesis was born. Patient, technique, often ungrateful, led by Jewish, Christian, and agnostic researchers, by sincere believers, and by rigorous skeptics. Their common ground was not ideology. That was the method. And this method produced a first major revelation, something that, even today, remains largely unknown to the general public. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, is not the work of a single author. He never was. This is not a homogeneous text, written in one go, with one hand at a single time. It is a composite set, a patchwork of traditions, stories, of laws, of different styles. Some passages use archaic vocabulary, others much later. Sometimes God is called by a name, sometimes by another. Sometimes he is close, almost human. Sometimes distant, transcendent. It even happens that the same event, that is to say, told twice, with different details. This is not a copying error, that's a clue. One indication that these texts were compiled, edited, reorganized over time. The researchers mention different sources: priestly traditions, royal traditions, popular traditions, each with her own worldview, each with its own priorities, and above all, each with its own theology. Because ideas evolve. What people thought about God in the 10th century, this is not what people thought about God in the 6th century. What is expected of him, what he is accused of. This is explained by his will. These changes are visible in the text itself, provided one is willing to look. And that's where something essential happens. Because if the texts are composite, if they were shaped in different contexts, then some central ideas have not always existed in the same form. They appear. They are strengthening each other. They become dominant. The idea of elections is part of it. It is not absent from ancient texts, but it does not always occupy the same place there. She does not play the same role. It does not carry the same symbolic weight. Sometimes, Israel is simply one people among many, protected by his God, just as other peoples are defined by their own. Then, gradually, something is changing. The God of Israel becomes the only true God. the others become idols. The alliance is no longer local. It becomes universal in its claims, and the election takes on a new dimension. It is no longer just a special relationship. That's a radical statement, a dividing line. We and the others. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It leaves traces, tensions, internal inconsistencies. But one thing is clear. It corresponds to moments of crisis, of rupture, of existential danger. And from there, the idea of election can no longer be read like a simple spiritual statement. It becomes an object of history, a concept that has a birth, an evolution, a function. And it is precisely here, at this precise moment in the investigation, that the idea of elections is beginning to change in nature. From the moment we accept this idea, that texts have a history, another interpretation becomes possible, a less mystical reading, even more disturbing. Because what researchers are beginning to see, it's not just a theology, but a legal architecture, a structure. Look closely at what is called the alliance. In tradition, it is presented as an act of divine love, a free choice, an undeserved favor. But if we set aside sacred language, and that we observe the internal mechanics of the text, something appears with disturbing clarity. The alliance functions like a contract, a very precise contract, very detailed, very demanding. On one hand, God promises protection, military victory, agricultural prosperity, longevity on earth. On the other hand, the people are taking action, strict obedience to the law, respect for the commandments, religious exclusivity, and in the middle, clauses. If you obey, you will be blessed. If you disobey, you will be punished. The drought, famine, defeat, exile, everything is written, black on white. It is not an unconditional relationship. It is not absolute love. It is a conditional relationship. Do this, and that will happen. Don't do it. And here are the consequences. You've seen this type of logic before. You know her intimately. This is the logic of any ancient political system. A sovereign protects. The subjects obey. Stability depends on respecting the pact. And what makes this reading even more striking? The thing is, it's not unique. When researchers began to compare these texts along with other ancient documents, they made a decisive discovery. The structure of the biblical covenant strangely resembles that of vassalage treaties from the ancient Near East. Hittite treaties, Assyrians, Babylonians. The pattern is almost identical. A great king appears. He recalls what he did for his vassal. He lists the obligations. Then come the blessings for faithfulness and curses for rebellion. Even the literary form is similar. Even the solemnity, even the symbolic violence of sanctions. And that's not all. When we compare biblical laws to Babylonian laws, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, here too, we find disturbing parallels. Rules about property, on debts, on inheritances, on punishments. Sometimes, the difference isn't in the content, but in the justification. Where Babylon invokes the authority of the king, Israel invokes the authority of God. But the function is the same: organizing a company, maintaining order, to ensure cohesion. At this stage of the investigation, a conclusion is slowly emerging. The alliance is not just a theological idea. It is a political tool, a way to structure a people, to legitimize a law, to reinforce obedience. Because a human law can be debated, disputed, upside down. A divine law, much less. And this is where the idea of election begins to transform before our eyes. It is no longer a mere spiritual, privilege. It becomes a function. Israel is not chosen because it is superior. The text itself says so. He is small, weak, vulnerable. He is elected to accomplish something, establish a precise order, a state governed by divine law, a disciplined society centered around a single narrative. The election, from this perspective, is not a medal. It's a burden, a collective responsibility. And above all, it only makes sense as long as this structure exists. As long as there's a territory, a temple, sovereignty. Because without a state, what is the purpose of a political contract? This question, for a long time, was not asked. Or rather, she was suffocated. Because answering it leads to a dizzying level of involvement. If the alliance is a contract, if election is a political function, therefore, it is not eternal by nature. It depends on historical conditions. It can be broken, transformed, reformulated. And at this stage, something is starting to take shape in the background. A specific period, a breaking point, a moment in history where this construction becomes not only useful, but vital. Because great ideas are never born in comfort. They emerge in the midst of the crisis, in defeat, in existential danger. And the higher the stakes, the more powerful the story becomes. So the question is no longer just what an election is, but when exactly it becomes indispensable. Why is this idea gaining such traction at a specific moment in history? Why now, and not before? This is where the mystery deepens. Because to answer this question, we need to look at one of the traumas, the deepest in Jewish history, an event that changed everything. But why does this idea appear in particular at this point in history? 586 BC. Remember this date, not as a simple chronological marker, but like a fracture, A before and one after. That year, Jerusalem fell. Not symbolically, not partially. She's taken, ravaged, shaved. The Babylonian armies enter the city. The temple is destroyed, stone by stone. The religious, political, and symbolic heart of the kingdom of Judah reduced to ashes. This temple was not just a building. He was the visible proof of the alliance, the place where God resided, the sign that Yahweh was protecting his people. And suddenly, there is nothing left. No temple, no throne, no kingdom. Even worse, the Babylonians did not simply destroy. They deport the priests, les scribes, the political elites, the intellectuals, all those who carried the memory, the law, the story, torn from their land, taken more than 1,000 kilometers away, in Babylon. To understand what this means, it requires an effort of imagination. Imagine that everything that gave meaning to your world disappears in a generation. Your institutions, your symbols, your certainty of being protected, and around you, an infinitely more powerful civilization, richer, older, more confident. Babylon, at that time, is one of the intellectual and religious capitals of the world. His gods appear victorious. Its temples are still standing. His laws work. And you are a defeated people. That's where the real crisis arises. Not just a military crisis or politics, an existential crisis. For if Yahweh is the God of Israel, how could he have allowed his temple to be destroyed? If the alliance were eternal, how can this total defeat be explained? Two answers are possible. The first one is simple, brutal, devastating. Perhaps Yahweh is no stronger than the gods of Babylon. Perhaps he is just a local god, defeated by another. This is how dozens of peoples disappeared before them, assimilated, absorbed, forgotten. In 1 or 2 generations, their gods become folkloric, souvenirs. Their children speak another language. Their identity dissolves. This was the normal fate of vanquished peoples, and the Jewish elites in exile knew it. They had seen him elsewhere. They understood the danger. The greatest risk was not physical death. That was assimilation, the silent disappearance. And it's here, in this abyss, that something extraordinary is happening. An act of radical creativity, a narrative genius. Faced with the possibility of disappearing, another interpretation is emerging, and she changes everything. No, they say, Yahweh has not lost. He was not defeated. He punishes. The destruction of the temple is not a sign of abandonment. It's a sign of anger. The people have betrayed the alliance. He worshipped other gods. He corrupted the law. He forgot his mission. Exile is therefore not a definitive defeat. This is a correction, a temporary test, an educational punishment. And this reversal of meaning is decisive because it transforms the catastrophe as further proof of the relationship with God. If he punishes us, it's because he can still see us. If he corrects us, that's what we still matter to. From there, another idea is taking shape. Yahweh is not just another God. He is not a local God. He is the only true God, the creator of heaven and earth, the master of history, the one who uses empires as instruments of his will. Babylon did not win. Babylon was used. And what about the Babylonian gods? Mere idols, wood, stone, illusions. This is where strict monotheism originated. Not an abstract, philosophical monotheism, an existential monotheism, a necessity for survival. For if Yahweh is the only God, even in exile, even without a temple, even without territory, the people can continue to exist. The relationship is no longer tied to a place. It becomes portable. It can be contained in a text, in laws, in practice. It was at that precise moment that the old traditions are brought together. The stories are compiled, organized laws, myths reformulated. The Torah takes its final form, not as a mere memory of the past, but as a bulwark against assimilation. Every rule becomes a boundary. What we eat, what we don't eat, when we work, when we stop, how to mark your body, how one passes on their name. Everything becomes meaningful. Every gesture says, we are not Babylonians. The election then changes its function. It is no longer just a distant memory. It becomes the heart of the system. We are being punished. So we are still elected. We are suffering. So the alliance is still active, and this idea is incredibly effective. It allows a landless people to remain a people. It gives meaning to suffering. She transforms humiliation into a mission. It is no longer, why has God abandoned us? It is, how can we regain our dignity? And from there, the narrative becomes unassailable. Because every criticism becomes further proof. If we are still suffering, it's because we're not ready yet. If we are rejected, the ordeal continues. You can see the power of this construction. It absorbs everything. She explains everything. It protects identity. But it also has a huge consequence. The election ceases to be a political function linked to a state. It becomes an essence, something that is part of a long-term process, almost in the blood. And it is precisely this transformation, born in urgency, in the fear of disappearing, which will endure through the centuries. Because this story, forged in exile, was not just a response to Babylon. It was an invention capable of outlasting all empires. And this story, forged in haste, will become one of the most powerful in human history. From exile, everything is falling into place, slowly, methodically, with cold lucidity, because survival no longer depends on military strength, nor of a territory, nor of a king. Survival now depends on a story and its ability to be integrated into every everyday action. It is at this precise moment that the texts are reorganized, not invented out of thin air, but together, sorted, edited. Ancient traditions, sometimes contradictory, are integrated into a coherent whole. The foundational narratives are aligned. The stabilized genealogies, hierarchical laws, everything that could cause confusion has been corrected. Everything that could unify is strengthened. The Torah becomes more than just a collection of texts. It becomes a portable constitution, a state without territory, a nation without physical borders. But most importantly, a system of identity reproduction. And at the heart of this system, there are the rituals. Not like vague symbolic gestures, but like concrete markers. Visible, essential. Circumcision, first of all, an irreversible act, inscribed in the body. Impossible to erase. It is not an internal belief. It's a physical trace. She said silently, I belong to this people, even without a common language, even without territory, even without a temple. Then the Sabbath, a division of time, a refusal to live at the same pace as others. Each week, the world stops. We are not working. We withdraw. We remember. It's not just about rest. That's a statement. Time itself becomes a marker of identity. Then come the food laws. What we eat, what we don't eat. At each meal, an invisible border is erected. We don't eat like everyone else. We are not sharing the same table. And this detail is crucial, because assimilation almost always starts there, through shared meals, through mixed marriages, through the dilution of habits. Dietary prescriptions prevent this. They force the separation without violence. No speeches, just through practice. In addition to these rituals, there are also dress codes, the laws of purity, the cycles of festivals. Every detail counts. Taken in isolation, they may seem excessive, restrictive, obsolete, but taken together, they form a system, a remarkably effective system, because it is not based on individual faith alone. It relies on repetition. One can have doubts and continue practicing. One might not understand and transmit anyway. This is how an identity survives through the centuries. The rules are not only for obeying God. They serve to prevent disappearance. They create symbolic boundaries, not between good and evil, but between us and them. And this logic is not unique. This is precisely what modern research has confirmed. When archaeologists began excavating the layers of the Levant, they noticed something essential. The first Israelite communities, they were not radically different from their neighbors on a material level. Same types of houses, same tools, same pottery, no sudden break. Things are gradually changing. This is not architecture, that's ideology. An ideology enshrined in the text and in practice. Linguistics confirms this trend. The oldest texts do not yet know a strict monotheism. They speak of a God of Israel, among other gods. It is only in the post-exilic texts that the discourse becomes exclusive. There is no God but me. This statement is not merely theological, it is strategic. Because if there is only one God, so it is impossible to adopt another one. Religious assimilation becomes an absolute betrayal. The mythological comparison goes in the same direction. Creation stories, the flood, moral laws, they can be found elsewhere, in Babylon, in Sumer, under other names. But what the biblical writers do, It's a selection. They take it. They transform. They are redirecting. And above all, they centralize everything around a single idea, the election. This idea becomes the keystone. She explains why it's important to respect the laws, why we must resist assimilation, why we must endure suffering. We are elected, so we must remain separate. We are being punished. Therefore, we must purify ourselves. We survive, so the alliance holds. And this strategy works. Against all odds, empires pass away. Babylon disappears. The Persia, Greece, Rome. The people, however, remain. Without territory for centuries, without an army, without political power, but with a sufficiently powerful narrative to be passed down from generation to generation. We need to say it clearly. This is an exceptional historical achievement. Few peoples have achieved this. Recognize the human origin of this strategy does not make her any less admirable. On the contrary, it shows what human beings are capable of when they face annihilation. Creativity, discipline, memory. But here's the tipping point. Originally was a response to a specific crisis, AE. Solution to an existential danger begins with time to be perceived differently. What was once a strategy is becoming an essence. What was conditional becomes absolute. What was historical becomes eternal. The election ceases to be a tool for survival. It becomes a metaphysical truth, something that is no longer up for debate, which can no longer be explained, which is no longer contextualized. And that's where the problem begins, because a strategy works as long as it is recognized as such. But when it is made sacred, it changes its nature. It ceases to be an answer. It becomes a justification. Justification for the separation. Justification of perceived superiority. Justification for refusing the other person. And above all, it becomes transmissible outside of its original context. Other peoples will observe this mechanism, to admire it, restrict. We too are elected. We too have a mission. God is with us too. But this is the continuation of the story. Because before we get to that point, one last question needs to be asked. A simple question, and yet formidable. What's going on? When a survival strategy does it become an eternal truth? An idea that works never remains confined to its point of origin. When a mechanism produces cohesion, gives meaning to suffering, and justifies authority. He is being observed, then copied, then adapted. That's exactly what's going to happen, because the idea of elections, once detached from its initial context, becomes exportable. And the first major reappropriation arrives very early. With Christianity, the first Christians were Jewish. They know the texts perfectly. They live inside this story. But they are making a decisive move. If Israel were the chosen people, then the church becomes the new Israel. The promises are not canceled. They are transferred. The chosen people are no longer defined by birth, but by faith. Those who accept Christ enter into the alliance. The others leave. The mechanism remains the same. Only the border changes. We are the heirs. Our interpretation is correct. Our path is the only true one. And very quickly, this narrative becomes a tool of power. The Roman Empire adopts Christianity, and suddenly, the persecuted religion becomes the state religion. It is no longer just a spiritual promise. It's a political legitimation. God is with us. Therefore, our empire is just. Therefore, our domination is intentional. The plan is in place. It will happen again, again, and again. Centuries later, as European nations began to form, They draw from the same symbolic reservoir. We are a people apart. We have a mission. History has chosen us. The vocabulary is changing. The structure remains. Modern nationalism inherits directly of this election logic. It is no longer God who speaks explicitly. This is the nation, the fatherland, destiny. But the underlying principle is the same. We are unique. Our cause is just. Our values are superior. And when Europe expands beyond its borders, when it colonizes, when she conquers, the idea of elections finds a new field of application, the civilizing mission. We bring the light, the reason, true faith, true civilization. The others haven't reached our level yet. They need to be guided, answers, sometimes forced. And all of this is presented not as violence, but as a moral duty. God is with us. History is on our side. Morality is on our side. You see the mechanism. He's still the same. We are elected. Therefore, our actions are justified. Even when they destroy. Even when they crush. And this mechanism is not a thing of the past. He is still at work. Even today, leaders invoke God, or history, or the sacred identity of a people to legitimize their decisions. Wars are presented like moral battles, territorial conflicts like eternal rights, violence as historical necessities. The vocabulary is carefully chosen. Security, destined, mission, protection. But behind these words, the pattern remains recognizable. We are on the right side. They are not. We are defending something sacred. They threaten this order. And that is precisely what makes this idea so dangerous. Because it neutralizes criticism. If God is with us, then all opposition becomes immoral. If history has chosen us, therefore all resistance is illegitimate. If our identity is sacred, therefore any questioning is an attack. At this stage, the debate becomes impossible. Only strength remains. You have lived long enough to recognize this moment. That moment when the arguments disappear, where positions become entrenched, where everyone takes refuge in absolute certainty. This is where the idea of elections shows its true face, no longer as a survival tool, but like an exclusion machine. It no longer serves to preserve a threatened identity. It is used to establish a hierarchy, to be separated, to be justified. And this shift is almost always invisible for those who are inside the narrative, because they do not see themselves as dominant. They see themselves as chosen ones. They don't consider themselves violent. They believe they have the right to do so. They do not see themselves as unjust. They see themselves as necessary. That is why this idea has endured through the centuries. Because it is incredibly effective. It gives it complete meaning. It protects against guilt. It transforms the complexity of the world in a simple confrontation. We against them. But the more powerful an idea is, the more she needs to be questioned. And this is where the final question begins to emerge. If the election was a survival strategy, then a political tool, then a universal mechanism of legitimation. So what's left? When do we remove the veil of the sacred? And this is where everything comes together. Because deep down, beyond the texts, beyond the centuries, beyond religions, someone had already figured out this mechanism. A lonely man, excommunicated, isolated, without power, without an institution behind him. Baruch Spinoza. What he has contributed is not just a conclusion. It's not even a thesis. It's a method, a way of looking at human stories without destroying them, but without making them sacred. Spinoza did something radical. He stopped asking, is it true? Because it's sacred? And he asked another question, much more dangerous. Who benefits from this? Who benefits from this story? Who benefits from this belief? Who benefits from this interpretation? Not in the abstract. Specifically, who gains power? Who gains authority? Who gains legitimacy? This question changes everything. She does not deny the faith. She does not deny the spiritual experience. She is simply putting religion back to his human place. For Spinoza, sacred texts are human works, written by men, in specific contexts, to meet real needs. That does not make them useless. This makes them understandable. And above all, this prevents them from being turned into weapons. Because once you understand that the election is not an essence, but a historic building, something is being released. Human value no longer depends on an arbitrary divine choice. It becomes universal. No one is superior by heavenly decree. No one is inferior by nature. Different peoples have different histories, different trajectories, different stories, but none of them received a metaphysical privilege which would allow one to dominate others. And that is Spinoza's deepest message. Identity is not a problem. It becomes a problem when it transforms into superiority. To love one's tradition does not require belief that she is the only true one. Honoring his heritage, it does not ask to crush that of others. And you understand that in a way that few young people can understand. Because you have lived. You have seen ideologies presented as if eternal, then collapse. You have seen institutions to consider themselves infallible, then betray. You have seen absolute certainties to become historical errors. You no longer need that you are being told reassuring myths. You can handle the complexity, the nuance, discomfort. And that's precisely why this story concerns you. Because the real lesson is not, this belief is false, or this religion is wrong. The lesson is more demanding. It is an invitation to practice what Spinoza called the freedom to philosophize. That's to say, the courage to think without asking permission, the courage to examine that which defines us, that reassures us, what unites us, without hatred, without contempt, but without being blind. You have a rare privilege today. You are no longer obligated. Belonging is essential for survival. You can belong, knowing. You can forward without lying. You might like without idolizing, and that gives you a responsibility. Because the election narratives never truly disappear. They change shape. They become national, cultural, ideological. They come back every time that a group wants to feel special, threat, legitimate to exclude. And it's always the same words: destin, mission, identify, purity. You now know what they are hiding. You know how to recognize the precise moment where a story ceases to explain and begins to justify himself. And that's it. That your lucidity becomes precious. Not enough to convince everyone, not to win debates, but so that I am no longer manipulated. To convey something else to those who will come after you. Not fixed certainties, but a method. Spinoza's method. Read. To contextualize. Compare. And always ask yourself, who benefits from this? If this investigation has shed some light on the matter, if she put words based on intuitions you already had, so subscribe. Because some complex truths only survive if free spirits agree to circulate them. In a world saturated with slogans, choose the shade is already an act of courage. And remember this: the real election is not the one that a God grants. It's the one that every human being does. Choosing the truth rather than comfort.